Welcome, everyone. I'm Susan Ives, Director of Communications for the Living New Deal. Our mission is to preserve the New Deal's legacy by making people aware of what the New Deal was and did, and to promote the New Deal as a model for good government. Our website, livingnewdeal.org, documents thousands of New Deal sites across the country and is an ever-expanding resource for learning about the New Deal, its policies, achievements, and the leaders who steered our nation through the Great Depression. If you haven't as yet, please sign up to receive our newsletter, The Fireside. You'll get articles by leading writers and historians about the New Deal and why we need a New Deal today. And you'll learn about in-person events and online programs like this one. Tonight, we're happy to welcome Brooke L, author of Americans in a World at War, Intimate Histories from the Crash of Pan Am's Yankee Clipper, which won our New Deal Book Award in 2023. Brooke is Associate Professor of History at Boston University and has received a number of awards for her well-researched publications. Please join in the conversation by writing your questions into the Q&A at the bottom of your screen, and Brooke will answer them following her presentation. All of our webinars are recorded and posted to the Living New Deal website, as well as to the Living New Deal's YouTube channel and Facebook page. And we'll be bringing you some more webinars in the coming months, including a series on CETA, the Comprehensive Employment and Training Act, which during the 1970s was the largest government-sponsored artist employment program since the New Deal. 3 webinars in October will feature writers, artists, and scholars discussing the connections between CETA and the New Deal. Please go to our website to register, and we hope you'll join us. Your donations make our work and programs like this available to everyone free of charge, and we're grateful for your support. Now, it's our pleasure to bring you tonight's speaker, Dr. Brooke L. Hi, Brooke.
Hi, Susan. Thank you so much for hosting this, and thank you everybody for being here. I'm really excited to be here and talk to you about the book that I just finished, and I'm going to share my screen so you can see the slides, and Susan, you can tell me if this doesn't come through correctly. Are we good?
Looks good.
Okay, great. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to begin with some scene setting. I'm going to tell you a little bit about an event that a lot of aviation buffs and some World War II buffs know about. But what I'm going to tell you is based on never before used archival documents that I dug up. And then after I set that scene, I'm going to back up and I'm going to tell you how I came into this project and what I hope it shows. So we're going to start in February of 1943. This is at a critical turning point moment of World War II. And we're going to start with one of modern life's very common tragedies. You've probably experienced it yourself, and that is a plane delay. Only this plane delay was of the Pan Am Airways celebrated seaplane, the Yankee Clipper, and it was delayed by almost a week. First for maintenance, a backfiring engine, a sticky piston, then crew illness, then weather conditions. But this was not uncommon. Regular transatlantic air service from New York to Portugal, where travelers caught connecting flights to Britain, North Africa, and other danger zones, had been running for less than 4 years, only since the spring before Hitler's forces invaded Poland. So passported and vaccinated, 27 passengers and a dozen crew members waited for boarding instructions in their New York City apartments and hotel rooms, listening to the radio and reading the latest about the war. Frank Kuehl was anxious to get going. Manhattan was driving him batty, he said. The former Olympic athlete turned export salesman had spent the 1930s living it up as a bachelor in colonial Southeast Asia until he was forced to flee and almost killed during the Japanese invasion. Camped out in Greenwich Village, he likely pored over reports about North Africa, where he was now headed after talking his way into a job as a radio broadcaster, and where untested American troops had just been humbled by Rommel's tanks in their first face-to-face engagement with German forces near Tunisia's Kasserine Pass. It rather looks as though I shall be on my way in a very few days, Frank wrote to his sister on February 14. When he got there, he told her she might be able to hear him on the radio every night. He would keep up close to the action, he promised, and when the drive on Europe began, he would be right up there with the first ones. At her penthouse, just off Central Park West, the Broadway star, Tamara Drazen Swan, packed her things: a hat box, a shoebox, a suitcase piled with evening gowns, costume jewelry, hair clips, and sheet music. By February 19, she and other members of her USO's camp show troupe knew that they would be embarking first to England and then to other combat areas to entertain Allied forces. Cultivating the persona of a mysterious Russian songstress, Tamara had been known only by her first name and hiding her Jewish background since 1933, when she found fame by debuting the Broadway ballad, Smoke It's in Your Eyes. But she often thought about her traumatic escape from war-torn Ukraine in 1920 and the grandmother that she left there and who was by now almost surely gone. At his Upper East Side townhouse, George Spiegelberg, a 6-foot-tall hazel-eyed major on General Eisenhower's London staff, was enjoying a brief reunion with his wife and small children after nearly a year's absence. The stern Republican lawyer was no fan of President Roosevelt or his New Deal. In fact, he had run for Congress against the Democrats in 1934, but he was thrilled to have a wartime commission that he'd been dreaming about since 1918, when he was stuck stateside learning to fly observation balloons while his older brother found glory in France as an aviator. George had recently been recalled to Washington to defend the merits of Lend-Lease against skeptics in his own Republican Party. But now he was set to return to his post. He also readied his belongings: woolen underwear and socks, a shaving brush, vitamins, and a standard issue Colt 45 pistol. New York's newspapers hardly captured the horrors that these and 36 other Americans would soon be speeding toward at more than 150 miles per hour. In Europe, the Third Reich ruled over a more populated landmass than the United States. Across the continent, Axis leaders were growing harsher in their reprisals against every hint of resistance, and more than 3/4 of the Holocaust victims were already dead. Japan's empire had also reached its outward limits, stretching from Burma to the borders of Siberia on mainland China, across into the US Aleutian Islands, and down to Portuguese Timor, less than 500 miles from mainland Australia. The empire's soldiers now ruled over some 350 million people, including hundreds of thousands of American and European civilians and POWs who were confined to rapidly deteriorating camps. Some of those people were Frank Kewell's friends. And the nightmares of that winter extended far beyond the occupied zones. Hunger was stalking millions that winter in China. And in London, policymakers had just decided to divert more ships away from provisioning food-short India, setting the stage for a famine there that would cost the lives of yet 3 million more people. Like a vortex, this war devoured not just battlefields and their soldiers, but everything and everyone in its vicinity. Think of this: the vast majority of the world's 60 million or more casualties, fatalities in this war were actually going to be civilians. So finally, on February 21, Pan Am summoned passengers for flight 9035 to LaGuardia's Marine Air Terminal. Reporters and sightseers used to come to watch the airline's giant clippers. If you're not familiar, these are literally giant flying boats. They came to watch them lift off and land on the Long Island Sound, but now their movements were classified. Japanese forces had overrun Pan Am's string of bases in the Pacific from Midway to Hong Kong, killing or capturing about 90 of the airline's employees. So it was not inconceivable that the Axis would also target the airline's Atlantic network too. The Clippers still displayed commercial registration marks. This was necessary for safe passage through neutral Portuguese territories, which is where the commercial flights ran. But secretly, the Army and Navy had in fact commandeered the fleet after the US declaration of war and periodically diverted the crafts for military missions. These seaplanes were still the world's only aircraft capable of carrying large payloads across an ocean. Inside the terminal, at the check-in counter, the 52-year-old Harry Seidel handed over a one-way ticket. Harry was a company man who had worked his way up the corporate ladder at Standard Oil of New Jersey. He had been drilling in the oil fields of 1910s Oklahoma, then served as an assistant for a Standard subsidiary in Bucharest during World War I, where he distinguished himself by trying to protect Standard's Romanian properties under German occupation. And then in the 1920s, he became one of the company's top overseas directors. Now, in the middle of the war, Standard was facing its worst scandal in decades due to congressional hearings headed by Truman about its extensive and ongoing ties to the German chemical corporation IG Farben, or IG Farben. But Harry would not relinquish his post. He was returning to his firm's London office. Brokering international oil deals had brought him a tremendous amount of wealth and standing, especially for the son of a small town immigrant bakery owner. Other passengers filtered through the terminal steel double doors, some with obvious purpose, others with the air of secret missions. Ben Robertson was a proud Southern Baptist and Democrat with sensitive blue eyes and a lilting South Carolina accent. He showed up from his Midtown hotel wearing a silver identification bracelet announcing his new affiliation with the New York Herald Tribune. A seasoned newspaperman, he had reported from New Deal era Washington, D.C., London during the Blitz, and Moscow under the threat of invasion in 1942. But witnessing colonial rule next up in New Delhi during the Quit India campaign that fall had sorely tested his convictions that the Allies were merely fighting the good fight. Right before he got on the plane, he had just risked his press credentials in order to report critically on the British imperial effort in India. LaGuardia's security agents took special note of the appearance of a man named Manuel Diaz. Stocky with brown eyes encircled by spectacles, Manuel had co-founded the most important shipping agency in the Spanish-speaking world. Vessels entrusted to his care plied the waters between New York, Latin America, and the Iberian Peninsula, beginning with World War I, and they had been aiding far-right right-wing activists at least since Francisco Franco's coup, which overturned the Spanish Republic in the 1930s. He himself, Manuel, was suspected of fascist sympathies and arrested for smuggling oil and radio transmitters along with other goods off a Brooklyn pier only days after the United States entered the war. But he escaped conviction, and his technically neutral boats continued to cross the Atlantic, sometimes smuggling to the Nazis, sometimes transmitting information about Allied convoys to German submarines. So airport inspectors combed through his leather overnight bag, finding suits, handkerchiefs, bedroom slippers, a Red Cross button, and miscellaneous correspondence, but nothing incriminating. In Pan Am's lounge, the passengers waited. Here you can see a picture that was taken of the USO troop. Tamara is on the far left posing with the other women who were in her troop. And then shortly before 9:30 a.m., a series of bells rang out, signaling the crew and then the passengers to board. Captain R.O.D. Sullivan emerged from the code office, clutching classified data and route instructions, which he would lock in a safe on the flight deck. Rod, or Sully, as colleagues sometimes called the veteran flyer, could maneuver seaplanes more skillfully than just about anyone, soaring over and under bridges and steering through sea swells like speedboats before stopping on a dime. He had joined Pan Am in 1929 when it was still only a risky startup after spending the previous decade working as a Navy mechanic and a flight instructor in Southern California, as well as stunt doubling for Hollywood movie stars and performing test hops on Charles Lindbergh's soon-to-be famous Spirit of St. Louis. You can't make this stuff up even if you wanted to. So he helped to pioneer Pan Am's Latin American and then Pacific routes during the 1930s. And now he was commanding secret military missions between South America and Africa, as well as regular commercial flights to Lisbon. He may indeed have been one of the Pan Am pilots who was helping to smuggle uranium and other resources out of the Belgian Congo for the Manhattan Project. Sully had more than 14,000 flying hours under his belt, and he had just become, weeks before, the first person in the entire world to fly the Atlantic 100 times. So the passengers followed Sully and the other flight officers outside and down the dock. They tiptoed across the wing and stepped into the hull, once shiny silver, now covered in camouflage paint. From the lounge, the stewards then directed the passengers left and right into seating compartments. On the upper deck, crew members arrayed themselves at their own workstations. In front of them on the master's bridge, Sully and his co-pilots secured over the overhead emergency hatch. They tested the inner cabin phones and unlocked their controls. With weather forecasts double-checked, Sully eased the craft away from the dock, opened the throttles, and sped past Rikers Island. After reaching full power, it took roughly 30 seconds for an aircraft of this model, a Boeing 314, to break free from the surface of the water. The motors whined as it climbed away from the channel until about 8,000 feet, when Sully leveled the plane off. A course for Bermuda was set. After setting down at that British colonial outpost to refuel, the Clipper would then continue overnight through the dangerous mid-Atlantic air gap known as the Black Pit to Horta Harbor in the Azores. And then the following day, after setting off from Horta and flying all day without incident to mainland Portugal, the plane would crash in Lisbon's Tagus River, killing 24 of the 39 passengers and crew on board. Lives and careers would soon be destroyed in an instant, and a great airship, symbol of a distinctive era of American foreign relations, would be reduced to scrap. But because the plane crashed, it preserved a special paper trail that does not exist for other flights on this route that did not have an accident. And these hints gave clues to decades worth of personal and political choices that had brought the Americans on this plane to this shared place. So my book traces the backstories of 7 people on this flight, the 7 worldly Americans I just introduced you to, their personal histories, their politics, which had been forged in the transformative New Deal era, and the paths that had led them into war. Only 2 of them would survive the crash. My editor would want to say you have to buy the book and read it to find out who survives and who doesn't, but I'll tell you in the Q&A if you really want to know. Now, the people profiled here are not stand-ins for larger groups. They are complex people who were in some ways representative, but in other ways exceptional. They live lives of complication and contradiction, basically like most human beings. As their biographies accumulate and intersect, sometimes they work at cross purposes. They defy expectations. They defy some of the things that historians often will do to make a story clear. They spill out over social categories, national borders, time periods, and other schemes for order. And they put flesh and bone to otherwise hard to grasp events of global scope. They invite those who follow them to revisit even well-known histories with fresh eyes. So together, I hope the kind of cumulative portrait that they provide shows how a diverse cast of people were drawn into global crisis, how they navigated an era of unprecedented mobility and perilous interdependence, and how their deep and sometimes contradictory international engagements would shape and then in turn be strengthened, transformed, or else derailed by the US war effort. I think they better help to situate the New Deal era United States in the stream of world history and to better connect the New Deal era to the war that followed. Okay, so I'm going to take a step back and sort of talk about how I got to this. So if you went back in time and you told younger me that I would spend more than a decade researching and writing a book about World War II, I would have absolutely fallen on the floor in a fit of laughter. It was the last thing I ever imagined that I would do. I came of age during the 1980s and 1990s, during what the historian Emily Rosenberg calls the Great World War II memory boom, when signs of the good war fought by the greatest generation were everywhere. You will all probably remember this, Stephen Ambrose books and Steven Spielberg movies, 50th anniversary commemorations of the bombing of Pearl Harbor, video game reenactments of the D-Day invasion. When the History Channel debuted in 1995, and I was a young history nerd, so I was very excited. I was ultimately disappointed because very quickly it was overtaken by Nazi conquering fare, and I would refer to it with teenage disdain as the World War II channel. The conflict to me, or at least the way that Americans had commonly come to talk about the conflict seemed exceptionally well-traveled ground, and it was the last thing that I imagined working on. But over time, I started to think in more detail about how Americans were retelling their World War II history in the late 20th century, and what those storytelling conventions often obscured. If you think about the Living New Deal memory, it's the same thing. Is a lot of what happened gets lost over time and simplified in popular mythology. And so I wanted to sort of try to rethink World War II and get away from the late 20th century mythologies back to some of the real, visceral texture of that period. US historians have produced an amazing amount of really good scholarship on World War II. But in broad synthesis, the meta-narratives that have stuck have narrowed considerably over time. And I was dissatisfied with all kinds of things. I'm just going to tell you about a couple of them that are most relevant, I think, to this seminar. So one thing I was dissatisfied with was the way that the way that Americans talk about the war, is by usually bifurcating it into two non-intersecting halves. We like to talk about the home front and the war front. There's a common refrain in World War II American history that there's, the story of the men who fought and the people at home. And this leads to a mistaken assumption about who is where. For one, the home front is not at all a civilian space. In fact, soldiers are incredibly present on the home front, and an enormous GI presence transforms the United States in ways that we haven't fully grappled with. And people at home are still going abroad. So the home front war front divide struck me as too flat-footed. The second thing that I was frustrated with was the growing and overwhelming emphasis on the war's final chapters. Americans like to talk about the bombing of Pearl Harbor, and then they like to skip right away to liberation stories. So military histories of how GIs won, the frontline combat story of soldiers storming beaches. The other really common way that we like to narrate the war abroad is through high diplomacy. So summits with Churchill, Stalin, Roosevelt, we think instead of Sicily, Normandy, Iwo Jima, the beaches, we think of Tehran and Yalta and Potsdam. I talked about this at one point in a room full of historians, and I said, we like to do World War II like it's all beachscapes and chairscapes. And the historian Penny von Eschen piped up and she said she bought a commemorative chairscape in Moscow. They sell commemorative chairscapes in Moscow, so you can go get them, and you get little mini pewter FDR and Churchill and Stalin. The emphasis on the end of the war is really good for answering certain kinds of questions. So it can tell us, how did the Allies win the war? How did they actually retake all that territory? And it can tell us, how did the war set the stage for the Cold War, right? But a lot is lost from this emphasis on the final part of the war. What's lost from this framing is a necessary, subtle understanding of the road to war and the early years of the war. So the road to war story is often oversimplified into a story about FDR trying to coax an isolationist America into caring about world affairs. And then we often think of the story as involving an abrupt break with the bombing of Pearl Harbor, and then a very sudden, quick unification of the American population around a united war front against the Axis. And then the story shifts rapidly. The New Deal is sort of out. The war is in, as FDR himself put it. Dr. New Deal was replaced with Dr. Win the War. And so oftentimes we see that whole period as separate periods. But we simplify this history to our own peril. So I want to give you some context and sort of rethink some of these assumptions. Combat soldiers made up only a tiny fraction of the millions of Americans, both in and out of uniform, who scattered across 6 continents, both on the eve of and during the Second World War. Long before GIs began storming beaches and beyond the war's most famous battlefields, Americans forged extensive political and economic ties to other parts of the world. This included tremendous numbers of non-combatants in uniform. Just think of this, only an estimated 16% of American uniformed personnel saw ground combat in World War II, 16. And civilians were still traveling abroad throughout the war, not least on Pan Am's commercial networks. Between spring of 1939 and fall of 1945, Pan Am's regular transatlantic service alone transported 83,000 non-combatants back and forth across the Atlantic Ocean. Tens of thousands more traveled along the airline's Pacific, Latin American, and African routes. So filing down the gangplank went bankers, oil brokers, ordnance experts, physicists, farmers, photographers, purchasing agents, plastic surgeons, civil defense planners, fact-finding politicians, and more. To accommodate the demand, Pan Am doubled its scheduled service to Europe from 2 times per week in 1939 to 4 times per week in the summer of 1941, so still a half a year before the bombing of Pearl Harbor. After the United States entered the conflict that December, bookings climbed a further 140%. Between then and August of 1945, the airline's crews flying along regular routes that now stretch some 90,000 miles would make more than 18,000 ocean crossings. Now, passenger demand exploded from the very start of this global crisis, right, in the 1930s, because Clipper flights made improbable itineraries suddenly possible. They were built, these flying boats, for a world not yet paved over with runways. Unlike land planes, they could go anywhere within reach of a river, a lake, or a lagoon. So they took Winston Churchill to Washington, D.C. He, of course, insisted on driving. They took Roosevelt famously to North Africa, as I recently wrote about in the Fireside newsletter. They took Australian Prime Minister Robert Gordon Menzies around the world, but most of the people on these planes were far less famous figures: bureaucrats, former refugees, the sons of plumbers and cattle ranchers who had found themselves thrust by the crisis into unexpectedly urgent endeavors, hammering out trade deals, bartering technological know-how, greasing the wheels of Allied cooperation, and sometimes conspiring with enemy agents. These were the wars in between people, surfing along far-flung networks of trade, transport, and political maneuvering, knitting the US mainland to the world's other staging zones and battlegrounds in ways that defy simple imaginaries like home front and war front. So once I started thinking about this, I wanted to write a history of Americans in the world that captured some of this that I thought we had lost in a lot of our popular memory about the World War II effort, something that could portray the momentous, indeed calamitous first half of the war, sort of like a history of Americans in the world before the Allies were winning. Something that could also encompass the mind-boggling global canvas on which Americans' participation unfolded, and something that could unsettle conventional American World War II narratives that imply that Americans were simply reluctant heroes sitting at home, minding their own business until they were attacked, and then they banded together into a united front to defeat the Axis. This is, of course, a comforting but a misleading way to remember this history. So I started to try to think of how to explain what I was trying to do. And I started pitching this to people by saying I didn't want to do Saving Private Ryan World War II history. I was going to write like a Casablanca World War II history. That was the way I sort of envisioned the idea for this book. And the early version of this, I envisioned I would have chapters of a book on different kinds of people. So I thought I would have a chapter on foreign correspondents, and then a chapter on businessmen, and a chapter on relief workers, and so forth. You know, people that seemed like they would be important figures to follow. But I didn't like this because it seemed kind of like an invitation to self-fulfilling prophecy, because basically what I would be doing, which is what historians and biographers often do, is to figure out what we think is important and then find a person or a top, you know, a category that confirms the thing that we already thought was important, right? So I could pick categories of people that I deemed significant in retrospect, and find supposedly representative figures to confirm my suspicions. But, you know, this is somewhat problematic as a kind of empirical way of operating. So I started thinking about what's been happening to historical documents over the last decade. And I thought that, you know, the incredible, amazing digitization of vast amounts of historical material, from census sheets, phone books to yearbooks, newspaper articles, and passport applications, that this has really opened up an opportunity for historians to push at the boundaries of biographical method. What if I thought, instead of approaching people like archetypes, I regarded them as modes of inquiry? Instead of picking a person because they deem themselves important enough in retrospect to leave us an archive, or we deem that we've already decided they are an important person, what if I just took a random sampling of people caught up in a shared tragedy and then follow them, see what routes, topics, and chronologies they suggest are important. I thought this might too create a kind of, multifaceted picture of this war that couldn't be reduced to a single master narrative. And once I had decided on this method, I started poking around, looking at commercial, international air traffic. And it did not take me long after that to stumble on the crash of the Yankee Clipper. Due to wartime restrictions, newspapers released only a few of the names of a few of the passengers on board. But I took a trip down to the Pan Am archives at the University of Miami, and this turned up classified passenger and crew manifests, survivor testimony, and tons of other materials related to the crash. So I began running down the 39 passengers and crew members on board, and I found about a dozen of them who were possible to trace in any capacity. And over time, I found out more about some of them than I originally anticipated. So over time, I began to whittle the cast down to those whose biographies seemed to give the most value added and kind of moved off in the most directions. So I tried to let the people tell the story to determine the paths that I would follow. I've described before doing the research for this book, it felt like chasing rabbits down rabbit holes. And it was kind of an exciting way to work. Now, each of these folks turned out to be a unique challenge to research. I'd be happy to talk about the challenges of researching them in the Q&A if that's helpful. And each of them are intrinsically interesting, but together I hope they offer a set of reminders. They bring to life certain facts about the American experiences with this war. Not least, they highlight the degree to which transnational connections, many of them forged long before the bombing of Pearl Harbor, informed and shaped the actions, not just of interventionist politicians, think FDR and his emissaries, but all kinds of Americans, all kinds of Americans. Americans in this era, even those sometimes labeled by their opponents, quote unquote, isolationists, were in fact remarkably cosmopolitan. Indeed, I would argue they were curious and worldly in ways that Americans no longer needed to be after the United States emerged as a superpower at the end of the war. Of the 7 people profiled here, all but one of them was a child or a grandchild of immigrants, and 2 of them were immigrants themselves. Between them, they spoke almost a dozen different languages. Their diverse worldly engagements, forged again in the New Deal era, fundamentally shaped their wartime actions and attitudes, which took them to 6 continents around the world. So we can look, for example, at Tamara. She was a Russian-speaking Jewish refugee from the Ukrainian Civil War who immersed herself in the leftist politics of New York. First, the socialist garment worker organizing of her father, who was an interesting figure in the International Lady Garment Workers Union himself, and then the Popular Front world of a lover, the communist playwright Clifford Odets. She was among the entertainers who came out to try to save the federal theater program when conservatives set out to abolish it successfully in the late 1930s. And in a sense, her wartime service with the USO is really a story about that, the demise of that theater project, because the fact that anti-New Deal conservatives shaped the USO program explicitly to avoid the possibility of federally funded, federally administrated entertainment for troops meant that her rights and her recognition would be curbed because she was not considered, in fact, a part of the military or the US government. We could look at Ben, a Southern Democrat, and also, like Tamara, an early supporter of Roosevelt and the New Deal. During the 1920s and 1930s, while he was working as a journalist, he worked not only in DC, touting the New Deal, but also in Hawaii, Australia, and Java. He took newspaper assignments that took him to Europe, Guam, Aruba, and elsewhere. But he began to sour on the New Deal in the late 1930s, when Northern Democrats became increasingly open to challenging racism and supporting civil rights efforts, not least as Black voters began to stream from the South into the North and into the ranks of the Democratic Party. He was a college classmate and friend of Strom Thurmond, And by 1938, like Strom, then was calling for white Southerners to defect to the Republican Party. So his story is a very interesting one of a kind of person who moves away, who is an early extreme champion of the New Deal, who moves away, and in interesting ways, his domestic commitments to preserving white supremacist democracy in the US South begin to diverge in strange ways from his growing advocacy for Indian independence and other anti-colonial activism around the world. Another interesting case of trajectory is George. George came from elite old stock German Jewish background. He had family still back in Germany, but like members of the so-called Republican Eastern establishment, he saw Anglo-American law and constitutional government as the world's best hope for civilized peace. And this outlook led him early to support military preparedness, both in World War I and in World War II. He, like Herbert Hoover, he constantly quoted, had a real disdain for the New Deal. And yet, by the eve of the war, he was joining those few Republicans who put aside partisan differences to align themselves with the Roosevelt administration in recognition of the global crisis as a need to rise above partisanship. When Republicans in Congress in late 1942 began to make noise about canceling Lend-Lease, which of course would have been catastrophic to the Allied war effort, it's George who flies to Washington and is credited with saving it in testimony to Congress. Not a unified war effort at all, right? We could look at Sully, the pilot of the plane. He came from a family of poor Irish Catholic immigrants. After joining Pan Am, he would travel extensively across Latin America and East Asia. He lived for a time in Panama. His company prospered precisely because of US government assistance, from postal subsidies and Navy support to secret presidential funds from Roosevelt, which were funneled to help Pan Am build up its Latin American and its African airport system. But Sully, like Pan Am's founder, Juan Trippe, who was also a Republican, they were both Republicans, chafed at Roosevelt's regulation efforts, both of the air and other industries, even while his own company so clearly benefited from New Deal era largesse. A similar story unfolds, but in a totally different way, with Frank. Frank was a Republican and voted Republican throughout his life as well. He came from a family of Czech-speaking immigrants to Iowa. In the 1930s, he lived in Manila, Singapore, and Batavia. He traveled extensively across Asia and the Middle East, where he became deeply committed to the project of Western colonialism. So he opposed the New Deal also, but his opposition stemmed from the Democrats' seeming openness to anti-colonial activist cries for independence. This begins in the 1930s with moves taken to start to move the Philippines towards independence. And then, of course, Roosevelt during the war is also making a lot of statements that suggest he's going to back anti-colonial activists as well. After the fall of colonial Southeast Asia, he also redoubled his anger at Roosevelt and other allied leaders because of their Europe first policy. He thought that the Pacific should have been the place where the troops were sent first and where the war was most important. And he did not hesitate to say so in radio reports from MacArthur's headquarters in Australia. MacArthur, of course, let him say it because it was also in his interest. And we can talk about that if people are interested in how he was able to broadcast these horrible reports, these critiques, because he was not in the US. He couldn't be censored by US censors. Harry was the son of immigrants from Dresden who spent World War I in Romania, where he was briefly detained for commercial espionage before he moved to France in the 1920s to head up Standard Oil's foreign producing department. He became one of the company's top negotiators. He brokered important deals in Iraq and the Dutch East Indies, as well as became a go-between for his company and the Nazi-aligned IG Farben, the chemical corporation. His company, which had been moving oil refining and other operations offshore during the 1930s to escape growing US regulations, had to be strong-armed in the middle of the war into minimal compliance with the war effort. which was done by late 1942. Like Pan Am, Standard Oil executives such as Harry would take credit ultimately for the miracle of American production during the war, and erase both the history of the government's role in facilitating and making all of that industrial production possible, as well as their own complicated history of slow compliance or even outright opposition to the war effort. Finally, we could look at Manuel. He was a Spanish Catholic immigrant who had extensive ties not only to the Iberian Peninsula, but also Mexico, Cuba, and South America. He used those connections to further the aspirations of Francisco Franco and Spain's fascist-aligned Falange Party. In many ways, this is not so surprising. Manuel was a child, so it's within living memory when Spain went to war with the United States won and took all of Spain's remaining colonies and confiscated them for their own territories. And also, more broadly, his story is a good reminder that, in fact, large numbers of Americans were drawn to dictators and authoritarianism and continue to be drawn to it both during and after World War II. Now, none of these people needed the bombing of Pearl Harbor to wake up to world affairs. It's just that they did not agree about which wars to fight, when and which sides to join. They disagreed about diplomacy and military strategy, the purpose of government, the place of women and people of color in their society, the role of the press, the merits of capitalism and communism, and the future of the planet's colonies. They rooted for different political parties, different empires, different futures. By following them, it encourages us to think more subtly about the chronologies and geographic imaginaries we use to think about the war, to remember the war. Because hindsight can teach us how and why the Allies won World War II. But thinking forward in time through the eyes of individuals instead dramatizes how much Americans headed into this conflict, not with ultimate victory still in view or already in view, but still grappling with the fallout from previous global conflicts and still consumed by the passions and partisan divides of the pre-war period. It brings to life the singular emotions as well as the contingencies and the unknowns of the war's early years. And it offers a reminder of how compromising and complex this war was and drives home how quickly the world and human lives can fall apart. So let's return back to our plane and the flight on February 22, 1943. The plane reached Portugal at sunset. In the cockpit, Sully aimed for the mouth of the Tagus River and began the Clipper's descent 15 minutes ahead of schedule. On the passenger deck, those who had made the journey before preoccupied themselves with books or a last highball. Others craned their necks to catch a glimpse of Lisbon's rooftops as they appeared portside. Some noticed lightning flash in the distance as the boat angled down to land, and a few fought a queasy feeling in their stomachs as they saw the tip of the left wing just barely catch the water. With a prolonged crack, like the sound of splintering ice, the Tagus sheared the wing off, sending the craft spiraling out of control. Passengers, strapped into their seats, flinched as freezing water surged up around them. Unsecured lounge tables barreled through the cabins, pinning survivors as they groped for the non-illuminated exits. Others, thrown free in the crash, regained consciousness in a sea of debris. Fighting the undertow, they grabbed for nearby seat cushions, which sank like rocks. Survivors would later say, hey, you know what? It'd be really great if the exits lit up and if the seat cushions floated. Those who made it to shore alive stumbled into crowds of emergency personnel. It was like being born again into a strange and frightening world, said one survivor. And indeed, it was. The world Tamara, George, Harry, Manuel, Frank, Ben, and Sully had belonged to before boarding the Yankee Clipper's last flight was in many ways not the same world that survivors would find themselves in after the crash. The war before 1943 had been one of stunning Axis gains. The war after would instead be defined by sustained Allied victories. The United Nations, of course, would face setbacks and individual battles that would be won at too high of a price. But the Axis forces never regained the upper hand. It took less than 3 years after that for the U-boats to sweep the U-boats from the sea lanes and knock the kamikaze fighters from the sky, to storm the beaches and clear the foxholes. While FDR and other leaders of the Allies flew off to international summits to debate the planet's future and pose for the cameras. Axis tyrants, the subjects of increasingly serious assassination plots, retreated underground. It's this chapter of the war, when US diplomatic, military, and industrial might came alive, that generations of Americans have most liked to remember. But over time, that focus on the war's final stages has made it harder to remember just how close to disaster the world had come, and how much Americans' experiences and efforts had been intertwined with and built upon decades of work and resources and connections with other people around the globe. How we narrate US experiences during World War II matters, because the conflict continues to hold such a special place in the stories Americans tell themselves about who they are and who they want to be. It continues to shape public assumptions about how wars work or how they ought to work. In the 1980s and the 1990s, Americans understandably turned to nationalistic celebrations of US combat troops' role in the Allied victory, to honor an aging population of veterans, and to find a war to be proud of in the wake of Vietnam. But given the challenges of the 21st century, globe-wide threats to democracy, rising gaps between the rich and the poor, resurgent racism, environmental perils, all of which will require international cooperation and collective solutions, it's time to revisit Americans' road into and place among other people in this signal conflict. Also, studying individual lives using 21st century research techniques is an invitation to upend common historical habits, to investigate people for who they are, not according to pre-assigned labels, but how they think, where they go, who they encounter, what changes their mind, what doesn't change their mind, all of which determines the realm of the possible and what actions they might take. This may seem like a simple task, but it's also daunting, exciting, and bottomless. After all, maybe the most complicated thing in the world, the hardest thing to truly understand, is a single individual. So just think what 7 individuals with stories embedded in different corners of global history can tell us about how Americans found themselves in the midst of and fought all those overlapping conflicts that together would be remembered as the New Deal and World War II era. Thank you.
Thank you. That was an amazingly complicated and interesting presentation. Thank you so much, Brooke. We have some questions I'd like to pose for you, both my own and several questions in the Q&A. Yeah, one question, and I'm curious about this as well, looking for intersections between your presentation and the New Deal. When you mentioned that the USO accommodated performers that were sidelined by the demise of the Federal Theater Project, what is that relationship? How did that cause an effect?
I mean, it's really interesting because the Federal Theater Project, as a lot of people here probably know, was really important in putting talented people to work and keeping them in work, in artistic work during the Great Depression. The Federal Theater Project was targeted by conservatives as one of the most radical wings of the whole project, which included musicians and painters and others too. And when the war begins, or really after the draft starts back up in 1940, there's a lot of talk about what are we going to do to keep these troops content. There's low morale in the stateside training camps. These guys they're all being trained for war that the US isn't even involved with, and they have nothing to do. So they start finding their own entertainment. They do all kinds of crazy stuff. They invade area towns, and people say, we've got to do something. We've got to provide structured entertainment for them. And Democrats, want to revive something like federal theater, right? And they say, well, let's create, a program of federal entertainment. And conservatives say, no way, this is what we just got rid of. We totally object to this. In a communist country, in a fascist country, maybe it's the business of the government to provide this kind of thing, but it's not in a democracy. And so the conservatives managed to push against this and create instead what is a volunteer organization that takes under the umbrella a bunch of different groups that had been doing work for troops. So like the Red Cross, the Salvation Army, Jewish and Catholic groups, and bring them all together under the United Services Organization. The camp shows becomes a kind of piece of that. And it's not a government organization. So, for example, when this plane crashes and a lot of the entertainers are injured, Tamara is killed in the crash. They do not get government benefits because it's not a government program that they're working for. And they fight for those benefits, and it takes them decades, but by the 1950s, they've got a little bit of recognition from Congress. But it was conservatives fought fiercely against rebooting the Federal Theater Project. And people I know, Prescott Bush was the first director of the USO when it was started up. So so there's a lot of conversation going on about should we do this as like the Federal Theater, and conservatives are absolutely opposed to that, and it can't get through Congress.
That's really interesting, especially the role of the Bushes and all that.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned early about the home front versus the war front, and how our views of the war had been bifurcated in that way. And then you said that there was a heightened military presence on the home front,
Mm-hmm.
and that we're still grappling with the implications of that. And I'm wondering what those were.
So, okay, well, I'll give you an example that I've written about elsewhere. If you think about the very famous photograph, the VJ Day in Times Square photograph of a couple kissing in Times Square on VJ Day, we've kind of taken on board that iconic vision as a couple celebrating the victory. But it's not. It was actually a man who grabbed a woman who didn't want to be grabbed on the street. And New York itself had been an encampment. New York was inundated with troops, and city officials and others were trying to figure out how to cope with this military presence in their midst. And so when people think the men are away and everybody else is at home, it doesn't really recognize that something like a quarter to a third of the US military is always stateside. And it creates all kinds of interesting jurisdictional questions about, who gets to arrest a drunken sailor on the New York subway? Is it only, the MP, or can like a regular policeman do it? And so that history has been kind of buried, in large part, I think, because people don't a lot of times see it as critiquing the troops when you talk about the fact that these troops were they were committing, vandalism and doing things that were public law and order problems for lots of communities. So I think it's been politically difficult to recognize, the troops didn't always behave. And it goes back to the whole question of the USO, right? Where in 1940, 41, 42, 43, people are really concerned about this. You've got lots of numbers of men who are being drafted into these units and ripped from their homes and facing potentially, horrific circumstances. And they go blow off steam, or they want to. And so a lot of American efforts, city officials' efforts, but the federal government, and then these private organizations like the USO, are spent trying to find a way to sort of, corral the morale of these troops.
Yeah, one of the things that you talked about that impressed me was, we tend to think about those times, the New Deal and the war and all this, unity on the home front around getting through these crises. But there were people out there that were really making money on this.
Mm-hmm.
And when you chose the 7 people whose lives you've interwoven for the book, it seemed like many of them had business interests.
Yeah.
So how did you come to choose those 7 people who apparently had very different views of the New Deal and Roosevelt? How did you happen to choose those people to tell this story?
It is sort of a surprising feature that so many of them turned to be, so oppositional to the New Deal, which I think speaks to the fact that if you think of who gets on these flights, these are typically people who are wealthy. They are in high, places in their careers. so they seem to lean Republican. I like one anonymous attendee me is saying, considering the attitudes of conservatives and their anti-government stances, it's a miracle that the war was won in spite of them. I had that feeling too watching, because so many of the people who the US relied upon to help wage this war effort were not pro New Deal, or had a complicated relationship to the New Deal and Roosevelt. And so you needed the cooperation of the oil companies, but the oil companies were really anti-Roosevelt. And so the war is kind of amazing that it happened. And we've forgotten a lot of the complicated back and forth, the jockeying, for example, between congressional Republicans who were threatening Lend-Lease, and others who were in the Democratic coalition. So that is kind of an unsettling thing. We always think World War II was that one war, right? That there wasn't a lot of dissent and that everybody was kind of on board, and it's simply not true. There's one interesting public poll taken. More people after the bombing of Pearl Harbor were against getting into the war than before it. So that means that so-called people describe themselves as isolationists more after the bombing of Pearl Harbor than before it. So there's obviously, it sort of reminds me of today's political landscape. There's a lot going on there that when we tell ourselves this history of American politics as one of like compromise and conciliation and consensus is simply not the case. This period was really, really fraught, and there was a lot of pro-fascist sympathies around.
Yeah, one of the things that you talked about in your article for the Fireside was how these anti-New Deal, anti-Roosevelt business people were accepting huge amounts of subsidies from the federal government to get their work done. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think this is kind of an interesting dynamic, where Pan Am and more Pan Am than Standard Oil, I would say. Pan Am relied substantially on federal government assistance. Somebody here is asking about, is there a German or a British counterpart? It is true that Lufthansa, the British Overseas Air Corporation, received even more government support and had a closer relationship and was more government regulated. Pan Am kind of had the best of both worlds because they were getting government assistance, but they weren't being controlled the way that some of these national airlines, in France, the same is the case. But Pan Am was able to preserve the illusion that they were just simply a private corporation that had built itself up by its bootstraps and through its own genius, did all of these wonderful things. It's not unlike kind of Elon Musk, his sort of self-portrayal as, somehow a genius when he's taken in all this money of support from the government. Pan Am Standard Oil is a little bit different. They didn't take nearly as much, I would say, subsidies and things like that in this period, although I think now the oil corporations do. But they still depended on government leases to drill on public lands. They used the State Department's help in order to wheedle agreements out of foreign governments. And so, a lot of these companies need that partnership, even though in their publicity materials, they like to downplay it. They like to present themselves as somehow the genius of free enterprise, which after World War II, they have a huge success because they basically managed to market, the war's victory as caused by themselves. And so a lot of the anti-union, anti-regulation backlash after World War II is due to this successful PR campaign that these companies waged to suggest the genius of American ingenuity is all in private enterprise and not the plodding, inefficient federal government.
So there's a couple of questions and we only have a couple of minutes, but one of them is, was there a counterpart to the Clippers that on the German side or the British side, or were they an American creation? Did anyone in the other country produce them?
Yeah. So Lufthansa, the British Overseas Air Corporation, the French are all establishing long, far-flung international networks, mostly to connect themselves to their own empires. So the French are flying to Saigon, Britain's flying to South Africa and so forth. Pan Am is the first one that actually manages to get a commercial air route up across both of the oceans, the Pacific and the Atlantic. But there's a kind of, it's like the equivalent of the space race going on to see who can get their planes to fly longer and more reliably over time.
But they didn't necessarily have a military role.
The planes did, yes.
They did.
Yes, after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, they were commandeered by the U.S. military and secretly used for military business when necessary. Sue Damasi is saying, how long did it take to get from New York to Lisbon? So typically they would stop over in Bermuda, and then they would overnight across to the Azores, and they would arrive at Lisbon. So it's kind of like 2 full days with stops. This was much more comfortable than flying coach today. You got fed nice meals, you could walk around. There was a women's bathroom and a men's bathroom, and all kinds of nice cutlery and things, so it wasn't quite as uncomfortable, although the cabins were not pressurized and they flew much lower, so the folks on these planes could see boats on the Atlantic. You could see the towers of a submarine if you passed one, or a shipwreck, and oftentimes the planes would see this and then would report the downing of ships and so forth back to U.S. authorities.
So I'm afraid this is going to have to be our last question, but there's a lot of curiosity about who survived. And I'm personally curious about, do they know the cause of the crash?
Yes. So someone asked about Ben Robertson. So he was in the Blitz in that haystack in East London, which I write about. That was before he got on this flight. And Ben was terrified of flying. He really was terrified of it. And he does not survive this crash. And Tamara does not survive the crash. The 2 people who survive are, one, George Spiegelberg, the Republican who puts aside his partisanship and saves Lend-Lease, and the pilot. And the pilot secretly was concluded to be the cause of the crash out of quote unquote exhibitionism, because the pilot was an old school veteran flyer who didn't like the growing regulations of the industry, and he flouted convention and he did what he wanted to do, and he didn't follow the rules. And so they determined that he had made a hasty descent and had tried to land at an angle that he wasn't authorized to land at. And they had learned that he liked to make what they called a fancy swerve upon landing, where he would dip the wing, like, just do a his little signature move. And that because it was at dusk, he had misjudged the distance from the wingtip to the water and clipped the water. And so he never flew professionally again, but he did fight Pan Am to try to stay on, and never conceded that this is what happened.
Brooke, thank you so much. We could continue talking about this for a long time, I think, but I've learned a lot, and I'm sure our audience has too. So thank you so much for being part of our webinar series, and to all of you who are on the Zoom call, and for your support of the Living New Deal. Your generosity makes this kind of program possible. So thank you for that. And Brooke, thank you again.
Thank you so much for having me.
Good night, everyone.